to have been involved in a way in this story.
Well, Monsieur Levy, before I ask you more about your trip to Libya, let me ask you one quick thought. I don't know if you heard, the Libyan media is saying that they have information, you know, a dark secret about Monsieur Sarkozy, and that it could be information that would cause his leadership to fall. Have you heard about this?
What is the credibility of an information coming from this bouffon of Mr. Gaddafi? He's a clown, he's a bouffon, a bloody clown. This guy who thinks that Sardaigne belongs to France, this guy who pretends that Al-Qaeda is behind the freedom fighters of Libya, this man has no credibility. Whatever he says, it will have no importance. He's just a crazy Neron, you know, an illiterate Neron, the Roman emperor. What he will say has no importance. I'm not so sure we should bother your viewers with that.
Well, a number of our viewers wrote in, of course, with emails for you, sir, as we have an interactive show here. So I'll put an email we got to you, if I may, that came in from a viewer by the name of Zahir Ahmed, who wrote in about the no-fly zone. He says, the idea of US intervention is chilling, but the killing of Libyans must be stopped. A no-fly zone through a UN decision seems to be the right thing to do. Now, of course, France is looking for UN mandated validity to go through and create a new no-fly zone. The European Commission has just advocated that. But do you think that will give it enough credibility to take intervention?
I'm sure of, you know, I went to Libya in order to listen and in order to learn. I went to Libya with a very humble and modest way of approaching the problem. I went there to learn and to listen. What I heard is two things. Number one, please don't steal our revolution. Please don't put your hands off the Libyan revolution. You French had your revolution 2 centuries ago. You achieved it by yourself. We must achieve by ourselves our revolution. This is point number one. Point number two, all the Libyan I met, people, average people of the street, youngsters, users of Facebook and Twitter before it was cut, and a representative like Mr. Abdel-Jalil or Mr. Goga said also, point number two, that there is just one thing they cannot do alone. One thing, which is to neutralize, to prevent the functioning of the 3 military airports from where the planes of the death of Gaddafi take off. This, they cannot alone do it. And they ask to the international community, under an international umbrella, under the umbrella of United Nations, or maybe you have other umbrellas than United Nations. You have the Arab League, you have the African Union, you have many solutions which would provide a legitimacy to a very limited, a very targeted strike in defense of the civilians, and of course not against the civilians, which would put Mr. Gaddafi out of the game. This is the only goal today. Right. All the Libyans I met during these days had one concern. Gaddafi must be put out of the game, whatever is the cost for him. No, of course not for the Libyan people.
Right. Now, interesting you talk about the hands-off sentiment, because from Tunisia, we had an email from a Libyan who's living in Tunisia. Reem Tweleb wrote in saying, I think the West's role should be limited to punishing Gaddafi, helping Libyans restore their stolen wealth, and recognizing the new Libyan National Assembly. Military action must be taken by Arab nations. That echoes very much what you just said, Monsieur Levy. Now, Syria has announced that it wants no military intervention from outside the region as well. I wonder how you think the dynamic between the East and the West will change. You mentioned this previous relationship with dictators. How do you think that the East and West balance will emerge?
First point about the military intervention, one detail. I wrote a piece in the Huffington Post last week saying the following: why not, at the end of the day, you have in the Arab world one very powerful army which is well equipped, powerful, which achieved the beginning of a real revolution, which is the Egyptian army. Why should we not imagine or conceive that the Egyptian people push its army to go to help and to give the hand to the Libyan brothers? After all, when we made the French Revolution in 1789, the French people, we had the desire, and we did it, to push the values of the French Revolution outside the borders to our neighbors. I dream of an Egypt who would push the conquest of its so fresh revolution outside toward, for example, Libya. So we could absolutely conceive these strikes on Sirte, airport of Sirte. There is not 10, not even 5, maybe 2 or 3 targets. Sirte, from where the fighters of Gaddafi depart, Sama, where the mercenaries of Niger, Chad, and elsewhere arrive, and maybe the bunker of Gaddafi. This can be done by an Arab army. We have in Egypt one of the best armies of the world and of the area after Israel. In the area you have 2 strong armies, Israel and Egypt. We can hope, and I do hope, that Egypt will help his Libyan brothers by providing this armed, very limited intervention. About East and West, I think that we are breathing. I felt it in Libya. I smelt it in Egypt. I was in Egypt just before Libya. There is a new air. There is a new atmosphere. Everything has changed. The fall of the dictators have liberated something. We breathe differently in Egypt today and 1 year ago. I was in Egypt 1 year ago under Mubarak. It was not the same air. It was not the same freshness. It was not the same discussions. There will be debates, of course, between East and West, between our political tendencies, but democratic debates, and not with this terrible and heavy burden of the dictatorship.
Now I wonder, Mr. Levy,
you will see how many problems will be solved in a much easier way.
Right. Now I wonder, though, how much the people of the West, the Western countries, will be able to trust their leaderships when what they've seen over the past, 20, 30 years is relationships where governments have been enemies, then friends with, and then enemies, and then friends with again. France was one of the first countries